Chapter 3 Emilay the Lame. For many days, Illorn and Emilay traveled under the guidance of Giborn. For the first time in their lives, they saw the great city of Aurora and fared past the growing sea. They ventured through the Eviratum forests of Anwil and trekked upon the Evir mountains. In time, they entered what Illorn's father called the lands of Aullen, and were regularly warned that their lives were no longer safe. For he told them that many had been slain on their path, and that they would no longer travel at night. Nor would they light candle or set fire, not that it made any difference. Giborn furthermore said unto his party, "Never again may you let loose your shields and swords, for the time it takes you to pick them up again is the time it takes the owls to lift you up into the air and drop you to your death, save when they choose to devour your eyes and ears." Emilay gulped and patted his brow. He was told their pace of stopping was nigh, though he nevertheless watched the sun as it slowly eased into the west. It was not long thereafter when they had arrived at Hushire, which smelt of waste and rotting flesh. No one bathed in this place, or washed, for that matter. Illorn had never imagined that such a place could exist, for everyone's face was black with ash, and their hands too. Blacksmiths worked hard, striking their anvils and building a store of swords. Armorsmiths did the same, though no one could afford plate. Instead, all wore leather and weak chainmail. Illorn turned to look at Emilay, who was plugging his nose, as he was sure the ground was made of dung, which it probably was. Giborn called the horses to a stop, and a woman approached him, saying to him, "Welcome, Commander. Are these thy sons?" Giborn smiled, answering, I would hope so. But the fat one, no, I bring him here to bait away Aullen." She laughed at his joke. Neither Emilay nor Illorn knew who Aullen was, but they figured he must not have been a kind fellow. "This place stinks," said Emilay, still covering his nose. Giborn bade them to get off the wagon. They had been traveling for many fortnights, and had long since walked. "Fret not, for this is not where you are to be stationed," said Giborn. A look of relief came upon Illorn's friend. "You are to fare with the train, and shall go to Elitha. There you will join the fight." The woman athwart him went blank. "Elitha," she said, "son or not, may I remind thee that they are new, and in need of training." "Bah," said Giborn, "my son is capable. Now show them to the armorsmith. They're in need of protection. I am late, and I'm to take my company of 20 men to Elitha within the week." Illorn and Emilay walked through the outpost of Hushire for some time. The place was wet with puddles and moist grounds, though they were informed that it had not rained for some time, as chamber pots were commonly dumped wheresoever men pleased them to be. They stopped just before a small smithy. Its roof was made of dried leaves, its walls of cobble. A man was within, clinging away at his sword. He turned and said, "What may it be?" Their guide answered, "Commodore Giborn has asked me to equip these two with mail and leathers." The blacksmith rubbed his nose. Nothing seemed unusual to him until he saw Emilay. He laughed and left a black-stained hand upon his print. "Perhaps for this one, but for that one?" He laughed again. "I have not a suit of armor to fit a mother bear, may I remind you?" Emilay looked down at himself. His belly hung past his linens and covered his manliness. "Maybe I don't need armor," he said. The blacksmith continued to laugh as he pulled from a hook a chainmail shirt and tossed it to Illorn. "Those were made to keep the talons of owls from scratching you." It rattled in Illorn's hands. It looked like it could hardly keep a dull stick from scratching him. "But you know, fat boy, I have naught for you. and I don't intend on making you a special suit." 3 days would pass ere the leaving into the wildlands. They made no friends, and spoke to no one, save themselves. All eyes that crossed them gazed at them with distrust and enmity. Illorn noticed this, though when he approached Emilay over the matter, he was assured that the angry faces were in his head, that he had been making them up. This was not so, however, as the faces were indeed angry. They felt loathing aspirations to dismantle the weak from their ranks, mostly to save themselves from having to share with one who does not contribute to their cause. They were looking at Emilay, and because Illorn remained friends with him, they thought him to be just as bad. It was little surprise to Illorn that they were forced to walk in the back of the train, behind aught else. Under unusual circumstances, the weak and elderly marched at the head of the train, so that they may not be left behind. However, it was apparent that they would have better luck reaching their destination if a crippled bovine led their train than if it were Emilay. It was midday when Emilay snuck on board the wagon ahead of him. It carried supplies necessary for their journey, as well as food and reagents that were in short supply. When he had, the two men on board swore their horses came to a halt, and that the back of their wagon had sunk to the earth, lifting the front end well into the air. This was only half true, as the horses did indeed come to a halt, but only for they were spooked by the sound of the breaking rear end of the wagon. Therewith many things fell forth unto Emilay, and for all halted to repair what was shattered. But for the day was noon, the company, under the command of Giborn, ate dinner ere they continued onward. They would not sup, however, as the journey was long, and they could only afford to break their fast twice a day. Now, Emilay was aware that he would be missing a meal, which meant trouble, for when the day gan to western, he grew hungry again, and having grown hungry, he slowed to an inching, limping, lame walk, if it could be called a walk, and fell behind. More so, poor Illorn was forced to be with him in his lamest hour. Seeing the lame mode of his friend take effect, Illorn called for aid, though the train ahead of him did not hearken. Rather, the two men before them made an insidious gesture towards them for having caused their wagon to break, and went onward without a heed of their plight. They were hideous men, Illorn thought, and too were they with sour souls for leaving them behind. Anon they were gone, consumed under the cold blanket known as the darkness of night, for it had grown dark, and it had grown cold. Emilay had fallen face first into the mud, lying thence still and unmoving. He looked as though dead, and perhaps he was for a moment. Illorn attempted to lift his massive shoulders, but he only fell forth again, splattering wet mud upon their leggings and linens. "My God, stand!" shouted Illorn. It was in vain. Therewith he unsheathed his sword and smacked his friend with the flat end of his blade, causing him to shoot up from the earth in a sharp writhe of pain. "We're as good as dead for you," said Illorn. Emilay nodded and began to cry, for he knew it was true. The coldness had come, and they could see no fire, feel no warmth. In these hours Illorn had almost forgotten of his mother. Emilay took from his satchel a moldy cut of cheese and stuffed it into his mouth as he sobbed. His stomach growled as he did. "Illorn, your father is in command. Surely he will return for us." Illorn looked forth into the yonder end of the path and saw naught, for it was dark. "Perhaps he shall, my friend, and I hope he does. But he would have done so already, surely." "Then perhaps he is returning to us as we speak." Illorn's mind became hopeful at the thought. But it was not enough to convince him otherwise. Or perhaps our falling behind is not within his account, Illorn suggested. Emilay rubbed his eyes, leaving a trail of mud on his face from his sullied glove. They had been away from the train for more than an hour. Emilay looked through his bag with want of more food. He opened his mouth, his breath smelling of death and cheese. Illorn, said he, you have more. But thereupon he was hushed by the finger of his friend. It shook on his lips. Illorn did not realize it at the time, but most men would have felt safer putting their finger to the muzzle of a famished bear. Silence, whispered Illorn. Emilay could hear nothing. A cold streak of sweat fled from Illorn's brow. His wits finally caught up to him. The darkness has come, said he. Night has fallen. Emilay lifted away Illorn's finger, thereupon saying to his friend, the sun has been asleep for nigh a quarter hour. Yes, it has. Illorn put his arm to ease, attempting to recall his father's instructions regarding being in the woods at night, forlorn and frightened. Emilay, inquired Illorn, have you your arms, your shield? He turned to inspect Emilay. He had naught to defend himself, save a bad smell. Emilay, whither lost your sword and shield? Illorn was struck dumb. His expression was lost between shock and fear. I had let them go, for they wore my arms numb and weak, and— You fool! Shouted Illorn. Emilay flinched, though the air around them did not seem to change, as it was silent. Illorn reassured himself of his own blade and shield, which were still present with him. More importantly, he still had his bow, his most favorite of things. He bethought himself and recalled the instructions of his father. When fighting that what flies, do so against a wall, so that none may strike from behind. There were no walls, but there were trees 10 yards from them. He furthermore remembered his father's foreboding, pray to never meet an owl in an open field. Illorn was many times reminded of what the owls could do to a man in the open, and now, being in the mercy of his own fate, he no longer wished to be like Fifnir, the great explorer. No longer did he wish to become a well-sung hero in a tavern of mirth, bliss, and joy. All he wanted was to be home with his mother. The algid breaths of heaven rasped their necks and sweat sluiced faces in ways that should have bothered them. It was freezing, and they thentofore had never been without sight of a hearth or home for so long. But such discomfort received no heed from them, for they were warned by a fear ignited by the familiar and irksome sound of wings striking air. Illorn, for those seconds, forgot his defenseless friend. He was thereby stricken with a longing for light and a lonesome attitude towards the darkness. Oh, how he took the sun for granted for all his life, and how powerless he felt to be a victim of the forces of the world. He'd been taught that darkness was the owl's ally and best friend. It welcomed them with its bitter cold and mysteries, while scorning aught else with dismay that could not be dealt with, save by hiding indoors. Hitherto he could feel their eyes on him, their beaks and unaccountable teeth designed for tearing, gouging, maiming, and murdering. Illorn then lifted his head towards the beauteous night sky. It consulted him like an angel before death. Yonder he could see the forests, which he had only hope of escaping into, and grabbed into Emilay's muddied jerkin. I pray you, Emilay, with all your strength run with me. The desperation in Illorn's eyes let forth tears that could not be seen. Now, one may as well shout daylong to a tree to sprint hence and receive equal success, shouting the same to Emilay. But that night, there was something different in Emily's heart. and soul. Perhaps it was the urgency of his friend or a want for life. Nevertheless, he fled at the pace of frightened horse or doe being hounded by 10 wolves with a hunter at their tail. Upon so, Illorn ganged to chase after him, amazed at Emilay's swiftness and secret agility. But Illorn, much to his surprise, could not outpace his friend, let alone catch up to him. And ere long he was gone into the darkness. The shadowy boughs of bower of the yonder forest had concealed Emilay. He could not be heard, he could not be tracked. Wherefore Illorn was alone and scared. 10 paces without the forest, Illorn yielded his run, for fear checked him. He shook and he trembled. His breathing was loud and did him only ill, for verily he knew that aught with eyes and ears was aware of his presence. Just then he heard the sound of bird taking flight, and it startled him so terribly much he resumed sprint into the woods, not stopping or slowing until tripping upon a large mound that sent him falling. It was Emilay, who had knocked himself senseless running into a tree. Now, Illorn would have arisen and resumed onward had he not noticed it was his friend. So senseless he seemed the kin of stone. Illorn crawled to him and shook his motionless body in vain. But thereupon the sound of wings and bird song terrified Illorn, leaving him bereft of braveness and heart. The sound became a thunder, a choir, and a death song. It thumbed and hushed aught else into silence, save Illorn's prayer for mercy and aid, but to no avail. He took his friend by the shoulders and dragged him to a tree where he used his body as a shield, crying, "Father, help me," though he knew it was no use. The heavens were visible only through small holes made by the spaces between trees. The total darkness, he saw the many birds above him fly in circles, though he could see only their form. Upon seeing the first, he shut his eyes and thought of what was to come. First, their talons would pierce his skin. He would feel their cold feet upon him, and he would attempt to shake them off like foul insects that have no business with him. Secondly, he would learn the kiss of the owl, as his father called it. They would bite away at him hastily, though never take away from him a cut of flesh bigger than a coin of gold. Illorn then thought of the blood, wondering how long the tribulation would be that ere he was clad only in muscle and tendon. But thirdly, he knew they would go for his eyes and his tongue. They would force themselves into his mouth if they were small enough. In these moments, he hugged Emilay tightly, loving him and wishing the world goodbye with his tears and mourning.